Włączania się już. Patrzę właśnie, sprawdzam, czy pan profesor już się podłączył. Jeszcze na wszelki wypadek sprawdziłam, czy dobrze godzinę, ale mam nadzieję, że uda się to połączenie. Bo jeszcze nie widzę, zdaje się, pana profesora Serhija Płochija.
Jeszcze go nie ma. Może warto sprawdzić jeszcze może maila, czy tam nie ma jakichś problemów.
Nie, właśnie ja sprawdziłam. Przed chwilą jeszcze raz też wysłałam link, żeby na pewno, tak, więc chwilę jeszcze może poczekajmy, tak?
Różnica czasowa, miejmy nadzieję, że mimo wszystko uzgodniliśmy odpowiednio tam.
Nie, tak, sprawdziłam. 13:30, u pana profesora jest wtedy 7:30. Więc chwilę poczekajmy jeszcze. Tak, ja już dostałam informację od pana profesora, że próbuje się łączyć. O, szczero witaję panie profesorze. Ja дуже рада, що вам вдалося. Ми вже тут, вже в нервах були.
Окей. Радий вас бачити.
Ми також вас раді бачити. Я спочатку буду говорити польською, а потім дам голос. Добре, я хочу представити тебе польською. І так, як ми домовилися, лекція англійською. Потім питання, які, думаю, що будуть, так що, okej, добре. Szanowni Państwo, witam zatem bardzo, bardzo serdecznie na naszej drugiej części sesji plenarnej, na której wysłuchamy wykładu pana profesora Serhija Płochija z Uniwersytetu Harvarda, z Instytutu Studiów Ukrainoznawczych, gdzie pan profesor którym pan profesor kieruje. Myślę, że nie trzeba by długo pana profesora przedstawiać, bo wszyscy bardzo dobrze znamy, ale ja tylko przypomnę, że swoją drogę naukową pan profesor związał początkowo z Uniwersytetem w Dniepropietrowsku, później na zachodzie Uniwersytet w Alberty. Był także przez bardzo długi czas, przez ponad chyba 10 lat wicedyrektorem Centrum Ukraińskich Historycznych Badań imienia Petra Jacyka w Kanadzie, a od 2007 roku pracuje właśnie jako profesor imieni Michała Chruszczewskiego na Uniwersytecie Harvardzkim. Od 2013 pan profesor jest dyrektorem Instytutu i proszę Państwa, jest autorem bardzo dużej ilości książek, które wzbudziły naukową dyskusję w naukowym świecie zajmującym się badaniami wschodnimi nad Europą wschodnią, nad Europą postkomunistyczną. I może tylko, proszę Państwa, przytoczę takie najbardziej opiniotwórcze książki pana profesora. To jest Brama Europy, historia Ukrainy od wojen scytyjskich do niezależności, Ostatnie imperium, rozpad i krach Związku Radzieckiego. Jak najbardziej w dzisiejszym naszym temacie także Zaginione Carstwo, historia ruskiego mira, czyli ruskiego świata od 1470 roku do współczesności. Także Czarnobyl, był tematem badań pana profesora. Czarnobyl, historia katastrofy jądrowej. No i ostatnia książka też, która wyszła w kwietniu, która ukazała się w kwietniu 2021 roku, Nuklearne szaleństwo, historia kryzysu kubańskiego. Pan profesor należy do jednych z najbardziej opiniotwórczych badaczy właśnie naszego postkomunistycznego obszaru i z tym większą satysfakcją mogę go Państwu tutaj dzisiaj представлять і bardzo dziękuję. Дуже дякую тобі, Сергію, що ти сходився на лекцію. Ми дуже раді почути твою наукову думку на нашій конференції. Віддаю тобі голос.
Dziękuję bardzo, Professor Matusiak. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And we have today, of course, a special day. It is December the 1st. 30 years since more than 80% of eligible voters in Ukraine went to the polls to answer the question whether they wanted Ukraine to be independent or not. And more than 90% of them, out of those more than 80% of eligible voters, voted yes, they wanted independence. The Soviet Union was gone within 1 week. And the question is, why? Was it a coincidence? It was gone at the meeting of the three leaders of the three Slavic nations, at that time Soviet republics, at Belavezha, in Belarus, very close to the Polish border, by the way. And the question, one of many questions about the fall of the Soviet Union, was whether there was a coincidence or not. Because the answer that the Ukrainian voters were answering, or the question that the Ukrainian voters were answering, was not about whether the Soviet Union should continue or not. The question was whether they wanted their one of 15 republics, which was Ukraine, to be independent. And by saying yes, they actually put an end to the existence of the Soviet Union. They answered that question for the citizens of Russia, for the citizens of Belarus, for the citizens of Kazakhstan, and for almost every other republic, with the exception of the Baltic states and a number of others where there was already a decision made about the independence. And the question is why? Why this referendum that took place 30 years ago turned out to be so consequential, more consequential than anyone expected to be? And that brings me certainly to the back 30 years into the history of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I will look more specifically at the role of Ukraine in that process, trying to answer the question whether that was a coincidence or there were some reasons to that development, that particular development of events. First of all, the fall of the Soviet Union, before that, the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989. So the wave of revolutions in Eastern Europe, what was known at that time as Eastern Europe, something that started certainly in Poland, created a lot of euphoria in the West. And it's around that time that Francis Fukuyama, a wonderful scholar and thinker, publishes first an article, and then later publishes a book where he declares the so-called the end of times, the end of history, suggesting that history reached its end in a sense of the development of the political ideologies, and that the liberal ideology emerged victorious and there is no really competition to it. Well, today we know that that was very optimistic, to say the least, view of the future. Today, with the war back in the region, Russo-Ukrainian war in particular, with the annexation of the Crimea, with the cyber warfare that is going on the NATO border today, we can talk about not the end of history, but maybe the return of history. When we think about the return of history, what I mean by that is that what we witness today is not something absolutely unheard of, something that never happened before, something that really puts us into a different dimension in terms of the time and in terms of history. But rather what I want to say and position is that we are viewing in many things a very banal story of the fall of the empires, the story that really defined in many ways the 20th century. We think about the 20th century as, first of all, the century of 2 world wars, the century of mass atrocities. Holocaust is certainly among them, deportations of the population. Poland, the entire country, was lifted and moved on the map of Europe. It's all 20th century. But if I would think about one defining factor of the 20th century that applies not only to Central Eastern Europe, that applies not only to Europe, but applies globally, that would be the disintegration and the fall of the empires. Starting with World War I, again, all these stories are fitting in that paradigm. And what I would say is that back in 1991, and it's not just Fukuyama, I'm not bringing his name in vain, but he reflected the spirit of the time. I thought the same way, and many other people thought the same way at that time. We believed that history was ended in a sense that the last empire, or maybe one of the last empires, in the Soviet Union, fell in a very unusual way. It fell without a major war. At that time, certainly the Chechen wars were still ahead, the annexation of the Crimea was ahead, certainly, and other developments. So that was unique. That was something that, again, didn't happen, at least didn't happen to that level, to that degree in the world history. And in the notes that I actually offered to distribute before the lecture, I start them with the comment made by Judge Cannon, one of the leading historians and theoreticians of the Cold War, the comment that he made in 1995 about the fall of the Soviet Union. I find it hard to think of any event more strange and startling, and at first glance more inexplicable than the sudden and total disintegration and disappearance from the international scene of the great power known successfully as the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And again, he was not outsider in terms of thinking about those developments. We all thought about the Soviet Union as an event. And what we know today is that it's not an event, or it was not just an event. We are dealing with a process, with the process of disintegration of the empire that comes with wars, that comes with atrocities, that comes with displacements, which come with moving borders as well. So this is the perspective that we have today that we didn't have back in 1991. And that perspective allows us to look a little bit differently also at the developments of the key year in that story, the year 1991, and at the role of Ukraine in that process. First of all, I want to start with inviting you to think about this history of the Soviet Union after the Second World War as basically history that was different from the history of the Soviet Union before World War II. And one of the major differences was that the rise in the importance of the republics in the Soviet Union after the end of the Second World War. Again, for those of you who maybe is familiar with, or at least looked at some of the photographs coming from the Soviet Union, you look at the leadership of the Soviet Union before World War II, and they are all people, again, they come from different parts of the Soviet Union. Stalin and his group comes from Caucasus, but they all have the positions in the central apparatus, in the central committee in Moscow. When you look at the composition of Politburo in the last, and that was for those of you who didn't live through those times, and Politburo needs explanation. So you look at the ruling body of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union with Central Committee, you see that there are not just people coming from different parts of the Soviet Union, they have posts outside of Moscow. And in particular, there would be always a member of Politburo that would come from Ukraine. And that started with Nikita Khrushchev at the start of World War II, when he was parachuted from Moscow to become the leader of the Communist Party of Ukraine. And that continued after the Second World War, in a sense that the leaders of key republics like Ukraine or Kazakhstan, and to a degree Belarus as well, would have also key positions in the Soviet leadership, which actually signified this shift, the change in the structure of power. Again, I wouldn't overemphasize that. The power was still in the center, but now there were the republics that actually had some say about what was going on there. And no republic had stronger positions in Moscow than Ukraine, that sent to the Moscow, to the Central Committee, two successive general secretaries, so the first secretaries, Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev. They were the products of the Ukrainian party machine. And the era of Brezhnev became known as the Dnipropetrovsk era in the Soviet politics. So why is that? Why Ukraine, through its, again, not per se Ukrainians, but through Russians coming from Ukraine, like Khrushchev and Brezhnev, why it plays so important role? One of the most obvious answers is that this is the second largest Soviet republic after Russia, in terms of the population, in terms of the economic potential. Second, very important thing is that it is a very troublesome republic. It was troublesome for the Soviet Union before World War II because of the mass peasant movement. Again, the biggest, so to say, private army in the Russian Civil War comes from Ukraine, and it is Nestor Makhno units that really counted thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people. It continues to be troublesome after the Second World War because of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Soviet annexation of Western Ukraine, Western Belarus. You look at the majority of the political prisoners in the Soviet camps in the 40s and 50s, and they would be Ukrainians. Mostly the members of the Ukrainian insurgent army. So you see this very interesting situation in which Ukraine has the most say in the center, in economic terms and other terms. On the other hand, Ukraine is actually produces the majority of the political prisoners of Gulag. And that tells you something about importance of Ukraine, both in the official political structure of the Soviet Union, in the Soviet economy, and in the movement, the anti-regime movement that is there and that is very widespread. So the biggest Helsinki group, once the human rights becomes an issue in the 1970s, the biggest Helsinki group outside of Moscow is the Ukrainian Helsinki group. So again, it's already different generation, different ideology from those people who ended up in Gulag in the 40s and 50s, but still this trend continues. So on a number of levels, we see that Ukraine, even before 1991, before Gorbachev's reforms that backfire, plays a very important role in the Soviet politics and economics, which comes with potential ability to either destabilize them or stabilize them or put them in a particular direction. Now let's move to and see what is happening around 1990 and 91 after the revolutions in Eastern Europe and how that affects situation in the Soviet Union, and again we'll return to the role of Ukraine in that entire story. First of all, it's very useful to look to understand the developments in the Soviet Union in 1990, 1991. It's useful to look at two historic maps. I will not show them to you, but I am absolutely sure that you will use your imagination, and these are the maps that all of you know pretty well. The first map is the map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the 18th century, before the partitions. And if you look at that map, of course, you will find that today's Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine are within the same polity, within the same borders. And those borders, it's very interesting, mattered in the 1989 and 1990. In a sense of the Polish developments, the one that started certainly with solidarity strikes in the 1980s, reverberate very strongly in the regions of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and in particular in Lithuania and in Ukraine as well. Unfortunately, I can't demonstrate my Polish here because it's almost non-existent in terms of active communication, but I read and I understand Polish quite well. And the way how I acquired that knowledge was by listening the broadcasts of Radio Free Europe in Polish during the events of Solidarity. Normally those broadcasts would be jammed, but in Ukraine they were not jammed because they were in Polish, and the idea was that at least in central and eastern parts of Ukraine, where I'm coming from, people didn't understand Polish. So it was a perfect really transmission. The quality of the sound was wonderful. And again, that's just my personal anecdote, but that reflects a much broader trend in terms of how people in the region looked and reacted to events in Poland. And from that point of view, if you look at the events of 1990 and 91, the first country, the first republic that declares independence in the Soviet Union in March of 1990, 1 year and a half before the fall of the Soviet Union, happens to be Lithuania. The first session of the freely elected parliament of Lithuania declares independence. Moving to Ukraine and looking again at the old maps and borders, I would suggest adding one more map, and that would be the map of Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the map of Molotov-Ribbentrop Europe, which would include, of course, the Baltic states, which would include the Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, and which would include Moldova, or at that time Moldavia. Well, this is the region that actually rebelled the first. That was the region that actually spelled the end of the Soviet Union in more than one way. I already talked about Lithuania. Estonia was the first country that declared sovereignty, and sovereignty didn't mean independence in the language of 1991, but meant the superiority of the local laws of the law of the particular republic over the laws of the Soviet Union. Again, Moldova is there as well. And in terms of Ukraine, the mobilization, the first wave of mobilization really comes in Western Ukraine, in former Polish Ukraine. We can very easily talk about that also as about the part of Austrian Ukraine and Austrian influences and influence of Galicia under Habsburgs. This is a possibility. But that map of the partitions of Poland wouldn't explain why Volhynia is also among the most mobilized pro-independence regions in Ukraine, which tells you that the existence of Galicia and Volhynia within one state interwar Poland actually had a very, very profound impact on the historical memory, on the population in that region. So again, it's not Austrian map, it's not the old Polish map, it's the map of the interwar Europe, interwar Poland. What does this mean for Ukraine and for the mobilization of Ukraine in the years and months leading to the fall of the Soviet Union? That means really that in Ukraine you have a number of models of mobilization against the center. The Western Ukraine and Galicia in particular would fit the model of mobilization that you see in the Baltic states and in Moldova. So this is basically a grassroots movement that comes from below, creates organizations like the Popular Fronts or Ruch in Ukraine to advance different agendas. And they start with the agendas dealing with ecology, where Chernobyl is extremely important factor in mobilization of Ukraine in particular, but Lithuania as well. They continue with the ideas of the importance of not just ecology, but also language and culture. In the mix, what they put forward is also the ideas of the freedom of religion. In Ukraine, in particular, this is the question of the recognition, of the legalization of the Ukrainian Catholic or Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church that was banned and forcefully reunified with the Russian Orthodox Church in 1946. So that's the kind of mobilization that you have coming in this Molotov-Ribbentrop Europe, and Ukraine is very much part of it. My predecessor in this position of professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard University, Roman Shporlyuk, put back then, at that time, a very interesting and provocative idea that if Stalin would be less successful in claiming Lviv or Lvov in Yalta, maybe the Soviet Union would still continue. And again, whether that would happen or not, the point that was made there was this extraordinary importance of Lviv, Western Ukraine, and I would actually push further the Molotov-Ribbentrop region area in the fall of the Soviet Union, and Ukraine was part of that. Now, what about the rest of Ukraine? The rest of Ukraine that was sending to Moscow people like Khrushchev, was sending to Moscow people like Brezhnev, the producing people like Volodymyr Shcherbetsky, who was very close to Brezhnev and who actually maintained, built this very strong party network. It's like a pyramid of power, a clientele of sorts that Monchak was writing about so well in terms of the early modern Europe and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So Shcherbetsky kind of recreated the Monchak clientele system in Ukraine in the 1980s. So there you see a different type of mobilization which finds parallels with mobilization in other parts of the Soviet Union. One of them is the mobilization of intelligentsia in the big cities. So this is what you see in the Soviet Union starting with 1988, 1989. the voters in Moscow or in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, or Sverdlovsk, they're sending to the parliament the so-called pro-democracy deputies. 9 out of 10 voters in Moscow vote for Yeltsin, for example. So, and that is story that you can see in the city of Kharkiv, for example. Some of these Russian pro-democratic candidates are elected in Kharkiv. You see also the mobilization of the working class and workers' strikes, and that is happening in the area of Donbass. And you can see clear parallels with what is happening in the Russian regions as well. And finally, you come up with a Ukrainian party elite that manages to bring together these two types of mobilization in the process that delivers the vote of December of 1991. And this is very important not to overlook, because again, it's something that doesn't sound really very attractive today, that the role of the party elite and party nomenclatura. But this is also something that without talking about which the picture would not be complete. And the path of Ukraine after 1991 would be actually very difficult, if not impossible, to understand. Because at the end of the day, it didn't take the path of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or the path of Poland, for example, where the mobilization along these lines of Molotov-Ribbentrop pact line would suggest. So Ukraine is in a different box, in a different column, and again, that's because of different type of anti-Soviet or anti-center mobilization of 1990 and 1991. So the party elite is there being very disappointed with what is happening in Moscow. Under the rule of Khrushchev and Brezhnev, they had actually free access to Kremlin. They had this wonderful future of careers in Moscow and all union careers, including members of Politburo. But with the arrival of Gorbachev in Moscow, who, in terms of his background, half Russian, half Ukrainian, this influence of the Ukrainian party machine in Moscow comes to an end. So the union has actually very little to offer to the Ukrainian party elite. And once Yeltsin becomes more and more important figure in Moscow, connection with Moscow becomes actually very dangerous, almost poisonous for the Ukrainian party elite. So Ukrainian vote for independence in the parliament takes place on August 24th, 1991. And that was the next day after Boris Yeltsin suspends the activities of the Communist Party in Russia. So that leads me to another suggestion which would allow us to look differently at the history of the Soviet collapse. And it's not the role of the party nomenclature in Ukraine. That's the point that I have been making for a while, so I'll leave it aside. I mean here something else. The Declaration of Ukrainian Independence, which is a very short document, says that the Ukrainian parliament, or Rada, declares independence because of the deadly threat that is hanging over Ukraine. And the reference is, of course, to the coup that took place in Moscow in August of 1991, between 19th of August and 21st of August, where the conservative aides to Gorbachev were trying to overthrow Gorbachev and return the Soviet Union back to where it was before the start of perestroika. But at the time when Ukraine declares its independence, the key figure in Moscow is not anymore Gorbachev. The key figure in Moscow is Yeltsin. And Yeltsin is in the process of staging a counter coup. So the plotters were trying to take power away from Gorbachev by locking him down in the Crimea. What Yeltsin is doing now is actually making his appointments of his people in the key positions in the Soviet government, including the Minister of Defense, including the Minister of Security, and other key positions. So at the time when Ukraine votes for independence, there is another coup taking place in Moscow, in which Russia and Yeltsin is trying actually to replace Gorbachev. So Ukrainian independence is declared formally against the Soviet Union. But in reality, if you look at the chronology of those events, this is independence against Russia. Very clearly, the distinction is very clear there. They don't want Yeltsin, they don't want Russia. The majority, the communist majority still would be able somehow to find a compromise, a sort of confederation with the Union and with Gorbachev, but not with the Russia of Yeltsin that tries to take over the Soviet Union. And this is the key reinterpretation of the events of August of 1991, which again have a huge repercussions in terms of what happens after that. Because the story of the fall of the Soviet Union, it's not just the story of the Ukrainian referendum. It's the story of two largest republics in the Soviet Union, Russia and Ukraine, refusing actually or not being able to find a model that actually would keep them together in one way or another. I will move now to the events of the Professor Matusek, my time, I still have some time or not? Or it's time to, okay, good. So I will move now to the events of December of 1991, which followed the referendum. And that was the meeting of the leaders of the Slavic republics in Belovezh. If you read carefully the memoirs of people who are present there and look those documents, formally the meeting is between the three leaders. But in reality, the Belarusians really serve as hosts for the meetings between Kravchuk and Yeltsin. And it is the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia that is happening in Belovezh. The Belarusians are shocked. They're not prepared to discuss the issue of the dissolution of the Soviet Union or complete independence. Once they hear this happening in negotiations between Yeltsin on the one hand and Kravchuk on another hand, they all gather together in one of these houses in that lodge, in that resort area, and start discussing, brainstorming, what are we doing, what should we do? And the decision is made, okay, whatever happens, the union or no union, we stick to Russia. We need oil and gas. But that's basically how surprised the Belarusians were, and what strategies they discussed. So the discussion is really between Yeltsin and Kravchuk. So in other sense, between Ukraine and Russia. And negotiations start with Yeltsin actually putting on the table the text of the new union treaty that Gorbachev asked him to suggest to Kravchuk. And Kravchuk says, well, I am sorry, but we just had a referendum. I was elected the president, and there is a clear mandate for independence. The time talking about union and union treaties is gone. And then the conversation takes a different track. Now, Ukraine, after all, was just one of 15 Soviet republics. why not to have a Soviet Union without Ukraine? President Bush, the first Bush, who was at that time the leader of the United States, was actually promoting the idea in 1990 and 91, saying that, okay, the Baltic states should go independent, but the rest of the Soviet Union should keep going the way how it has been going. It will be actually better for the Soviet Union without the Baltic states. And that is more or less the leitmotif, the foundations for his so-called Chicken Kiev speech, the speech that he gave on August the 1st to the Ukrainian parliament in Kiev, where he said, "You Ukrainians, don't confuse freedom with independence. You can be free without independence." That was the line of the United States all the way up until Ukrainian independence referendum of 1991. But then Bush heard something from Yeltsin before the referendum that he was really taken aback and was surprised because Yeltsin told him that, well, there is no point in having the union if Ukraine is not part of it. Why? Asked Bush. And the answer was a very interesting answer. I don't think it encompasses everything, but it's interesting line of thinking that is recorded in the American documents, and this is coming from the Russian president. He was saying, well, in the union without Ukraine, Russia would be outnumbered and outvoted by the Muslim republics. So at least the argument that is put forward is the argument about the cultural homogeneity of the union, or the majority of the Slavs, of the Orthodox Slavs in the former structure. But there were also other reasons, and the key reasons were money and finance. The entire Soviet Union was going through a major crisis at that time. And Russia was not an exception. Russia was in a better position because it had control over oil and gas. And in the fall of 1991, the decision is made in Moscow. Yeltsin, Gaidar, and others are part of this decision-making process, is that to survive, Russia would have to cut off support for other republics. Russia could imagine the continuation of the Soviet Union if there would be somebody else to carry the burden of the empire of the late 20th century. But without Ukraine, Russia would have no that kind of support. Later we learned that, again, resource-rich Russia didn't need Ukraine really for that, but that was not thinking in 1991. Ukraine was certainly an economic powerhouse in 1991, and imagine the continuation of the Russian imperial project without that chunk of the Soviet economy was not possible, at least for people who are making those decisions in Moscow. And now let me conclude by building a sort of a bridge between the events of 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, and what we witness today in the region, in particular in Ukraine and around it. One of the arguments that was put forward by people around Yeltsin when they were trying to get Gorbachev on their side in the fall of 1991 was that, well, we really don't have resources at this point to keep going as the Union. Russia needs these resources to survive and to rebuild itself. But make no mistake, and don't worry, in 20 years, the republics will come back in one way or another. And that was basically the idea, the vision for the next 20 years in Moscow around Yeltsin in the fall of 1991. This is all temporary. The Commonwealth of Independent States is created, and Yeltsin sells it to the Russian parliament and gets the majority vote on it by saying, okay, this is the only form under the circumstances to keep some form of control over the larger larger Soviet and larger Russian imperial space. You listen to Vladimir Putin in his speech on the annexation of the Crimea, and he is saying there that, well, back in December of 1991, we all believed that the Commonwealth was just a new form of the common statehood. And in this particular case, Putin was not lying. That was the perception. Those were the understandings of the of people around Yeltsin in 1991. So the idea of Russian sphere of influence, Russian control over the post-Soviet space, it was already formulated. It was there. It was the expectation, really, of the Russian elites starting from 1991. And from that point of view, you don't see much of a difference in terms of thinking between the leaders in Kremlin in 91 and now, especially given that this is actually the same group. Putin certainly was an assistant to Sobchak. Sobchak was very close to Yeltsin, so there is no change in terms of the group thinking within this elite. This is the very same elite that is there. Now, the attempts to keep the post-Soviet space under the Russian control, they went through a number of stages. There were Chubais with his idea of the liberal empire. Eventually comes Putin with his decision to use military force. And the biggest, the largest so far military conflict on the post-Soviet space, still ongoing conflict, is in Ukraine. Which brings me back to the thesis about the importance of Ukraine for the Soviet collapse. But I would say that the use of force and continuing confrontation with the West over Ukraine has the same roots as the reasons for dissolving the Soviet Union after the Ukrainian referendum. Like the existence of the Soviet Union without Ukraine in 1991, the reestablishment of the Russian control over that space without Ukraine would not be complete. And that's a perspective that history, that our deep dive into the fall of the Soviet Union can provide us on today. So I will stop here, and I would like to thank you for your patience, and I will be more than happy to answer whatever questions you might have.
Thank you, Professor, for such an inspiring and engaging lecture. And I see that we still have a few minutes. So, dear participants of conference, feel free to ask a question. Feel free to provide some feedback. It can be in English, Ukrainian, Russian, and now I think that it is possible also in Polish to ask.
Yes.
So welcome. Дорогі учасники конференції, так, дякуємо пану професору і запрошуємо до дискусії. Так, можна питати, ставити питання по-англійськи, можна по-українськи, можна по-російськи і по-польськи теж можна, так, виявляється. Так що просимо, запрошуємо, заохочуємо сердечно. Професор Микола Журба, просимо.
Professor Zhurba, Lugansk Regional Institute of Postgraduate Pedagogical Education. I have a question. How great the triad of Soviet Union revival?
Well, I believe that the revival of the Soviet Union is absolutely impossible. You can't enter the same stream twice. This is one thing. But second is that the thinking dramatically changed in Russia in 1991. The Union project, or the imperial project, was found to be economically not viable. And in that sense, the fall of the Soviet Union follows the fall of other empires of the 20th century, British in particular, when they decided that it costs too much to keep an empire traditional empire in the 20th century. It's not profitable anymore. And the model that Russia adopted is actually exerting indirect control, either military, political, or economic, over the post-Soviet space, getting the geopolitical benefits from it and economic benefits, but leaving it to the local governments to deal with the pensions, to deal with the COVID, to deal with other things and issues. And even in the case of Belarus, where theoretically there is a common state, there is still, that can change, but there is still very little appetite in Moscow for these 30 years to include Belarus completely into Russia, because that comes with expenses. The same we can look today at parts of Donbass. We don't know where it will end up, but clearly Russia is actually the model of annexation, like it was in the Crimea, is not on the table, at least not now on the table for the unrecognized republics. And the explanation is, in my opinion, the same. So Crimea is an exception in terms of annexation per se, because Russia is building a Russian nation state for the first time in centuries, where the ethnic Russian means that you are a Russian citizen and you can be annexed and integrated into the Russia. But Russian-speaking Ukrainian somewhere from Donbass actually is left in this limbo, economic, political, and otherwise. So again, looking at what is happening there and looking at the history of the collapse of other empires, I don't see the Soviet Union actually being revived. It's a new form of imperialism in terms of exertion, control, without actually moving the borders.
We still have a question in chat. This is a question from Dr. Denis Pilipowicz from the Polish-Ukrainian Department, Jagiellonian University. The question sounds, do you think that today's Russian-Ukrainian conflict is a stage collapse or revival of the Russian empire?
Again, I think that this is, as I responded before, there is no return to either empire or the Soviet Union in the way how they existed in the 19th or 20th century. But there is clear revival of Russia as a regional and now more and more as a global power. That power thinks in different terms about how it is going to exercise that power, extend it, and that is the most dangerous part. So Russia today is a revisionist power, the power that is prepared to start wars and conduct wars. Annex territory is something that didn't happen since the end of the Second World War. So on a certain level, the situation can be even more dangerous than it was during the Cold War, because during the Cold War you had a very clear red lines and understanding between the enemies. Now everything is in flux. Everything is sort of an experimentation. The equilibrium have not been reached like the equilibrium after the Second World War. So again, I see the revival of Russia as the imperial power and this new understanding of exerting power at a certain distance, but not the return to the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, because again, economically, this is not a viable option in the 20th century.
Вибачте, забула мікрофон. Я бачу, що є ручка ще в пана Микола Журби. Не знаю, чи це буде наступне питання, чи це не зняли просто. Пане Микола? Пане професоре? Є питання? Ще одне питання?
Не мам питання. Дякую bardzo.
Agnieszka.
Thank you. I have one question. What role do you see today for intelligence in the post-communist, post-Soviet countries?
Excuse me, could you please repeat? What do
What role do you see for intelligence in the post-communist country today?
Okay, the question is about intelligentsia or
Yes,
what?
yes,
Okay.
intelligentsia.
Because I wasn't sure whether this is intelligentsia or this is intelligence services. I can say that intelligence services have a bright future, so that's the first part of the answer. Now, the question of intelligentsia per se. This is the concept, the phenomenon that comes really out of the Russian imperial realities of the 19th century, which really acquired a new meaning during the Soviet times as a special third category apart from workers and peasants. But again, it comes from the 19th century, so now it became a very clearly defined social phenomenon. It's almost like a new rank or again, you feel the. I remember that different forms in the Soviet Union, and you put intelligentsia as your. I was born to parents with high education, so they were automatically intelligentsia. So there was a legal term to a degree. Now that term disappeared with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the legislature. But what happened to the people who belonged to that category? And for a while, it looked like in the 1990s, with the collapse of the economy, that this collapse in economy took the whole concept of intelligentsia with it. But in the last 10, 15 years, we actually see the return of the term in many ways. So the history, this cultural trend continues. As the growing group of people now is employed either as office workers or in IT or in other other forms of economy that have been developing, but they keep bringing with them that cultural code. So there is now no, unlike the Soviet times, there is no category, there is no social category, and so on and so forth. But there is a continuation of this cultural code. And you look at the Ukrainian Maidans of 2004, 2013, and 2014, there are different groups represented there. But you go there, and probably you had the same experience, and you are sure you don't have to make an appointment. You will meet people there from the Institute of History, Institute of Literature, people from the Academy of Sciences, people from other places who are there, who think this is their civic duty to be there, to be present there. So I would say that we turned the Soviet page on intelligentsia, but intelligentsia as a sense of responsibility toward your people and sense of engagement in the society. That thing continues. It continues from the perestroika years, certainly from the late 1980s. So it somehow survived the collapse of the 90s.
Thank you. Може я запитаю по-українськи, бо бачу, що в нас сьогодні є дуже багато наших студентів, так, польсько-українських студій. Може є в кого відвага поставити питання пану професору? Це остання нагода, так що може є відважні серед студентів. Запрошую, питайте.
Я готовий відповісти українською.
Так.
Якщо питання українською.
Так що питайте. Є представники кружка нашого наукового, так, Вернигора, так що бояться, так, поки що тише. Добре, have we got any other? Так.
Well, I just wanted to say that I guess this is a sign of the success of the presentation. Everything is so clear that there are no questions.
Maybe. This is the reason.
I hope so.
I can't see pani Wiktoria Stepanec, tak, studentka ważna, pani prezes, tak, koła naukowego.
Yes, I have some question about the topic of Soviet Union in the Ukraine. I mean that I am afraid that the fact that we speak too much about the Russian and about the Soviet Union in Ukraine, that it stalls the development of our country. And my question is whether do you suppose that such a big accent, a big like a large size of this topic in Ukraine can stall the development, because we speak always about that in any context, before war, after war, now, and so we can't like change maybe some context. We can speak about Ukraine, about the future of Ukraine, because we have 30 years of our independence and we still speak about Soviet Union and Soviet heritage. So the question is such. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very good question. Just to illustrate how important and significant this Soviet or anti-Soviet discourse is in Ukraine, you look at the events of 2013 and 2014, which is of course Maidan, Yanukovych, Russian aggression, annexation of the Crimea. But the big thing that is happening in history is toppling monuments to Lenin. So somehow the corruption of Yanukovych, the annexation of the Crimea, for one reason or another, is perceived, at least when it comes to history, through the eyes of getting rid of the Soviet legacy. So many things are understood in Ukraine, contemporary things, including through the lens of actually cutting this umbilical cord, somehow liberating ourselves from the Soviet Union and from the communist past. And there are some good reasons for that. Again, certainly we can think about the ways in which a lot of things that are happening in the Soviet in Ukraine have roots in the USSR, but Yanukovych was not product of the Soviet Union, in a sense that his rise to power, this is a phenomenon of post-Soviet Ukraine. So he would never, with his background, he would never make as high in the Soviet Union. So, but the protest against Yanukovych is also protest against the Soviet heritage, which means that this is something that is really very important to the society. This is something that I lack English term to say that, but in Ukraine they say that this is neprogovorene. So this is kind of a history, this is a trauma that is not being fully discussed, comprehended, the page is not being turned. And not being in any way, of course, the part of the group that is nostalgic about the Soviet Union. But sometimes when I see, especially among the younger generation who didn't live in the Soviet Union, blaming everything on the Soviet heritage, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable, despite the fact that ideologically I'm certainly very much in favor of cutting these links. So again, the same point is that we try to look through the Soviet lens on many things that are problematic parts of our life today, whether they have their roots in the Soviet past or not. And the only really way to deal with that is somehow to set a process of history, of discussion of the history, because the model was, okay, don't worry, this generation is dying out, they will die out anyway, and there is no real need for good discussion. But it looks like that the change of generations doesn't change the need to talk about the Soviet Union. So we keep talking, whether we like that or not. But again, I agree with you, and I see that there are also negative parts of that, being too much focused on the past and attributing everything to the past.
Thank you.
If I can jump in with one more example, one of my research interests is the history of Chernobyl. And what worries me really very much in Ukraine today is the fact that Chernobyl is discussed only as a historical phenomenon, closely linked to the Soviet mismanagement of the economy and so on and so forth. The question that actually the Chernobyl type reactors, they're not in Ukraine, but the danger that the nuclear poses is with us today, that this is our responsibility. That part of a discourse almost absolutely absent. When you talk about Chernobyl outside of Ukraine, this is very much about the danger of the nuclear industry today. When you talk about Chernobyl in Ukraine, this is about our past.
Thank you. Maybe this is not a good moment, but I can say that we in our Department of Polish Ukrainian Studies have Dr. Paweł Sekuła, and he is also a specialist in Chernobyl, the author of 3 books about it, and his, I can say, this is his passion to study the Chernobyl and the problem.
If you could send me the links to the I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes. Are there any other questions from audience? I can see. If not, we want to thank you, dear professor, for your time for the lecture. And I have an honor to invite you to stay with us on the conference today and in Thursday, maybe. And thank you, just thank you.
Okay, well, again, thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure. And I hope that one day we will have conferences in person as well. And
Yes.
we'll be free to do that. Again, all the best with the rest of your conference and your discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Serhija, for your interesting lecture and time for us.
Okay, do widzenia.
Do widzenia.
Dziękujemy bardzo.
Zустрічі, дякую. Proszę Państwa,
Chyba po polsku też.